we left off last week in chapter 8, and we read verses 22 and 23, but I want to go back and read those verses again. Where am I? I don't know. What do I have now? Oh, here we go. Okay. All right. So let's start again. We went through the story of Gideon. We saw his amazing, on the one hand, his amazing courage, his faith in God, very human though, and that he still expressed fear, a lack of confidence at various times. God reassured him, and he went forward and brought tremendous victory to the nation, and basically got rid of the threat of the Midianites, which was, amazing. And so as a result of all that, we see here in verse 22 that the people of Israel are so in awe of Gideon that they ask him to be their king. Okay. And he refuses. He says no. And hear what he says: I will not rule over you myself, nor shall my son rule over you. And of course, that's what they ask for. They want you, your son, and your grandson. They're clearly asking for a king. And one of the attributes of a king, as opposed to a different kind of ruler, is that it's hereditary rule. You start with one, and then you move on to the son, the grandson. And there's something inherently problematic of a king, which is something we, as people who have grown up in democracies, understand this very, very well. Of course, this concept was a bit foreign in the ancient world, but if someone like Gideon was clearly righteous and somebody who probably would have made an excellent king, but why does that mean his son is going to be worthy of being a king? In fact, one of the things we're going to see in our discussion today is he had one son that was the opposite of righteous, and he was the last person that should have been king. So I think that's relevant. I think it also tells us a lot about Gideon himself, that he's not looking for power or for honor or for glory. He was just trying to do his best to follow God's word and to save the nation. And okay, anyway, so that's what we see with Gideon. And again, that will be very relevant as we read the continuation of the story, which begins in chapter 9. I would like to just reference here something that becomes very, very relevant as we continue studying the book of Judges. There are many people that see the book of Judges as essentially paving the way for the book of Samuel. And the book of Samuel, really, the whole idea of the book of Samuel, the overarching principle of the book of Samuel is bringing us to the righteous king. Okay, the righteous king, of course, is David. And the book of Samuel begins with the leadership of Samuel, and who was a righteous leader. And then at some point, the nation asks him to appoint them a king. And Samuel himself is very, very upset with this whole idea, and he basically takes it very personally. I'm not good enough for you. I'm a righteous king. I haven't been corrupt in any way. But in the end, he says, okay. And indeed, they end up with a king, and they have a first try, which isn't that successful, although it starts very promisingly. Saul is not the final choice. He starts good. He ends up not so good. And then we go to David, and of course that's the ultimate. Okay, now what we have in the book of Deuteronomy, and I really meant to find this in advance, but I forgot to. But it doesn't matter. In the book of Deuteronomy, we have the idea of appointing a king, and there you have a built-in ambivalence about, is a king a good thing? Should we have the king or not? And maybe I'll actually find where it is. If somebody of you can help me find it, that's great. But in any case, what happens in the book of Deuteronomy is we have, I found it. It's Deuteronomy 17, verse 14. If after you have entered the land that the Lord your God has assigned to you and taken possession of it and settled in it, you decide, okay, or you say more accurately, I will set a king over me as do all the nations about me. You shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by the Lord your God. And then it goes on to give the various rules about the king. And it also assigns very definite limitations to a king: not to have too many wives, not to have too much silver, not to go back, not to have too many horses. So we have very clearly here, these verses themselves are as a very odd way of putting forward a commandment. And in fact, the commentaries have long debated as to whether it is a good thing to have a king, or whether God is allowing people to have a king if that's what they really want. And, one of the things it says is, I'd like to put a king to be like all the other nations. Okay, well, is that really such a good thing? Just to be like everybody else? I remember as a kid, I wanted to wear black Mary Janes because everybody else had black Mary Janes. Well, at some point I realized that I want to have, if I want black Mary Janes, it's because I like them. And if I don't like black Mary Janes, it doesn't matter what everybody else is wearing. I shouldn't be wearing them. So when you have these people asking for a king just because it's what everybody else is doing, it doesn't sound like it's a good thing. So there are those people, therefore, who say that a king, the whole idea of a king is something kind of, it'll happen because, or it can happen with the appropriate restrictions, if that's what the country feels they need, but it's not the ideal. Okay, and so what we have here, on the other hand, of course, we have this tradition of David being the king and establishing a house of David, and God himself promising David that his house will rule forever. And we believe, all of us, Christians and Jews, believe that the Messiah himself is a descendant of David and is basically going to restore the house of David. So that, on the other hand, seems to be a very holy sort of thing, this idea of a king from the house of David. So, but remains, again, it still remains a debate as to, even with the house of David, if the nation of Israel had been more righteous, would it have been possible to do without a king and to instead have a more direct relationship with God, with maybe temporary leaders, which of course is the model of judges. Judges, there is no king; they're temporary leaders. Some are better than others. So, but what we see here, Gideon's response to requesting to be a king, he wants to stay a judge. He wants to stay a judge. My sense is that he doesn't believe in this king dynasty stuff. Okay, he really sees his role as someone who is carrying out he's the instrument of God and carry out God's will. He's come for a season. He has saved the nation, and he will continue to serve the nation, but not to create a dynasty. Okay, but of course, again, that becomes very interesting in light of what happens afterwards. Then we see that something else starts to happen. And then Gideon says to them, it's not clear, by the way. There's a something to be understood. It's more or less a convention in the Bible. Whenever you have the word "and he said" or "as somebody said," okay, and if you have it one right after the other, two different statements like that with no response by somebody else in between, that's something you have to pay attention to. Okay, it can either mean that there's a missing response that you don't have, but it can also mean that the second response is not part of the same story. It happened later. It begins a new story. So if you notice here, in verse 22, the people of Israel say something to Gideon. In verse 23, Gideon responds to them. And then in verse 24, Gideon speaks again. So it's not clear if Gideon is continuing what he said. It's not a continuation because we have again, and Gideon said. So it's not a continuation. Was it said at the same time or what is it? It said later. I think from the context, it's said later. I think the Bible itself is putting two different statements of Gideon together to show us that whereas in verse 23, Gideon is beyond reproach. Gideon gives an amazing answer that indicates how modest he is and how he's really there just to serve the nation. He's not looking to be a king. And then all of a sudden in verse 24, we see the beginning of trouble, okay? And Gideon said to them, I have a request to make of you. Each of you give me the earring he received as booty. Okay, so it's clearly following this battle, okay, but maybe not necessarily right then, maybe the next day, maybe a few hours later. It's separated time-wise or chronologically from the discussion about being a king, okay, but it's connected. And then we have this weird phrase, that they were Ishmaelites. Okay, they're talking, of course, about the Midianites, who they've just fought, and they're basically saying the reason they have all this gold is because their Midianites are part of the general Ishmaelite culture. That's what they do. They have these things. Okay, so then they replied, certainly they replied, and they spread out a cloth, and everyone threw onto it the earring he had received as booty, or spoils or whatever. The weight of the golden earrings that he had requested came to 1,700 shekels of gold. This was in addition to the crescents and the pendants and the purple robes worn by the kings of Midian, in addition to the collars on the necks of their camels. Okay, now here we have very much a counterpoint in a way. They want Gideon to be king, and he says no. And then we see that they have just defeated these kings of Midian, all of whom are very king-like. They all have a lot of jewelry, and they have, we have the purple robes worn by the kings of Midian and the collars on the necks of their camels. In other words, if you have a kingly camel, the camel itself is going to be decorated to indicate this is the camel of the king. And by the way, if that reminds you of something, in the book of Esther, when Haman asks, when Achashverosh, the king, asked Haman to recommend how to honor someone, and Haman, of course, doesn't realize he's talking about Mordecai. What does he say to him? He says, takes the king's horse. And we see that the king's horse itself has a crown. The horse itself has a crown. The horse itself is decorated. And this is something that is characteristic of kings. They come with all that pomp and circumstance. So we have just now, Gideon has refused to fill that role in Israel, realizing, though, that the Midianites are very into that stuff. He is now going to take all of that booty, which, of course, is a way of bringing home that they, with their simple, modest, no king kind of civilization, have just defeated these mighty kings with all their symbols of royalty. But here in verse 27, we have a problem. Okay, Gideon used all that gold, melted it down, etc., and he made an ephod. Okay, what's an ephod? Ephod is probably best translated as a vest of some kind. Okay, some kind of garment or something that you would wear across your chest. And we see the word ephod showing up earlier in the book of Exodus, when we have the instruction in chapter 28 of all the various garments of Aaron and his sons, and the garments of the high priest. Now, you're all familiar with the breastplate that has the 12 stones on it. That breastplate sits on something that's called an ephod. Okay, and if you look back there, this is Exodus 28 verse 6, you'll see what is an ephod here made of? Gold, blue, purple, crimson yarns, and all fine twisted linen worked into design. So somehow the gold metal is also with various linens and other expensive and fancy fabrics, threads, etc. So here, definitely an ephod includes gold. And so we have here as well, he made an ephod, and he set it up in his own town of Ophrah, which he's from the tribe of Manasseh. He's there. And what is an ephod? Ephod, that breastplate is really part of the priestly garments. The ephod, and then on top of it, the breastplate, is something that only the high priest wears. It's supposed to always be with the high priest at the temple, at the tabernacle, before the Ark of the Covenant. This is where it belongs. And it's also something that's used when the people of Israel want to seek God and seek his answers. They will go to the high priest, and those stones will be lit up in different ways and will indicate what's God's answer to the nation. Now we see that, for example, that kind of pattern of going up to the high priest and through him asking God. We see at the very end of the book of Judges, when there's that horrible story, which we will get to one day, okay, the horrible, horrible story of the civil war and the whole nation that's going against the Benjamites. At one point, they go a few times, they ask God, they seek God's advice, should we go up to war? And what we see is here we go. This is Judges chapter 20, verse 27. The Israelites inquired of the Lord, for the ark of the God's covenant was there in those days. That was in Bethel. They went to Bethel. And Phinehas, son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, the priest, ministered before him in those days. Okay. And so basically, they're seeking Phinehas's wisdom and the word from the Lord. And our tradition tells us that this is how it worked. Phinehas, being the high priest, would have this ephod with the breastplate on top of it, and through that there would be communication between God and the priest, and then the priest would bring the word to the nation of Israel. But here we have an ephod. We don't have the stones, okay, but we have the ephod. It's not in the hands of a high priest. It is not where the tabernacle is. It is in Ophrah. So it's certainly not clear what was Gideon's idea here. What was his point? What was his motivation? We know, though, that Gideon was a righteous man. He believed in God. And so it does not make any sense that he was doing this to set this up as some kind of an idolatrous symbol. He probably was doing it as some kind of, I don't know, maybe even thanksgiving to God. See, God, look, this is all the gold that we got, and we dedicate it to you. And here's this thing, dedicated to you. But what happens as a result? There, all Israel went astray after it, and it became a snare to Gideon and his household. And we know that in the Ten Commandments itself, God says, don't create any statues, don't create any things. And this also, we see this happening in many places where something that maybe is set up, some kind of a symbol, can then become something very, very problematic and become something that serves idolatry. I would just show you an example of that from something we read in this week's Torah portion, this past week on Saturday. The Torah portion was from Deuteronomy 12. The Torah portion is called Re'eh. And here we have something very interesting that I think helps us understand the process that goes on here. So in chapter 12, verse 2, God gives an instruction to destroy all the various places of worship, pagan worship, that they will find throughout the land. And it says as follows: you must destroy all the sites at which the nations who are to dispossess worship their gods, whether on lofty mountains and on hills or under any luxuriant tree. Tear down their altars, smash their pillars, put their sacred posts to the fire, and cut down the images of their gods, obliterating their name from their sight. Do not worship the Lord your God in like manner, but look only to the site that the Lord your God will choose amidst all your tribes as his habitation to establish his name there. Now, many, this really kind of sounds weird, because it's clear from the first two verses here that they're coming into a land full of pagan worship, and they're told, destroy it all. Well, that makes a whole lot of sense. But then we have this weird statement: don't worship the God in this way, but only to a central place. Basically, what's going on here is that you're supposed to destroy these altars that are all over the place. Now, what is an altar? I mean, there's technical difference between an altar that serves the pagan God and an altar that serves God of Israel in the tabernacle, but they're both altars. They both are places where you're being sacrifices, right? So what actually is going on here? The Bible in Deuteronomy is telling us the pagans had these customs of putting altars all over the place, okay? And what God here is saying is, don't take altars that to worship God, not to worship pagan idols. Don't put up altars to worship God all over the place, okay? We're going to have one central altar, okay? What's the problem? I mean, it's very nice that you have central altars, but what's the problem, okay? And I believe, and we're seeing this later on in the book of Kings, what's the problem? In the book of Kings, every time I talked about the kings of Judah, there are a number of kings in Judah that the Bible tells us were righteous kings, but except for one thing. They're righteous kings, but they did not remove the high places. What does that mean? That even though for most of those years, until the king Ahaz, he was really a bad guy, but until him, okay, In the kingdom of Judah, there was no pagan worship. They worshiped the God of Israel, but what? They set up these altars in these high places, okay? And then what happens? And comes along Ahaz, and what does he do? He takes those same altars in the high places and turns them into altars to pagan gods, okay? And it's that dynamic that the verses in Deuteronomy are warning us against. There is a slippery slope here. You set up altars all over the place that resemble pagan worship. Even though you don't want it to become pagan worship, it can slip and slide into pagan worship, which is exactly what happens. And this is what we see is happening here. If Gideon himself put together this gold thing, I'm sure, I am positive that he wasn't planning on worshiping a pagan god with this gold monument thing, okay? Or whatever it was, okay? However, he wasn't supposed to do this, okay? An ephod, if you're making an ephod already, it needs to be with a high priest. It's part of a very strict type of worshiping vehicle, okay? You start taking this and using it for other things, even if your intentions are good, well, what happens next? Well, in the same verse, we know exactly what happens next. They started to worship this ephod, okay? They went astray afterward. Actually, it's very interesting. The word in Hebrew says in English, went astray. In Hebrew, it says vayiznu, which means to prostitute yourself. They prostituted themselves. In other words, it also reminds us of the kind of worship that we know existed for the Baal Peor in particular. We know about it from Book of Numbers. But this is a word that refers to pagan worship. Okay, and so that's very, very clear. And it says, and this became a snare to Gideon and his household. Now, how did we start learning about Gideon? Gideon is the man who, from the beginning, what did he do? He smashed the altars of the Baal. That's how he got started. And so here he is setting up, he's not building altars to the Baal, but it became a snare. He did something that was not appropriate, and it becomes a snare to bring him down that slippery slope to where they're going to end up worshiping the Baal. Okay, now we're going to see that a few verses later, that is ends up what's happening. Okay, so then at the end of this part, Midian submitted to the Israelites, did not raise its head again, and the land was tranquil for 40 years in Gideon's time. Now, I've mentioned in the past that these years that they tell you a judge reigned is very often indicative of a judgment of that judge. So let me just summarize some of these endings that we've seen in the past. The judge Othniel, the first judge, the son of Kenaz, it says the land was quiet, peaceful after his reign for 40 years. Ehud, the son of Gera, he's the one that took on that fat king Eglon, king of Moab, stabs the fat guy in the big fat stomach, etc. Okay, he has an 80-year peaceful reign, or the land is peaceful for 80 years. Deborah, 40 years. Gideon, 40 years. Okay, we're going to see later on that there's going to be a 20-year guy too. Okay, we clearly see 40 is very often biblically an archetypal number. For example, Moses goes up to God for 40 days and 40 nights each time he goes up to Mount Sinai. 40 years in the desert. 40, it represents a period of time, a complete and whole period of time. Someone who goes beyond the 40, if they're 80 years, that's kind of a way of saying this is a super duper time. It's not your standard, it's super duper. Anybody that goes less than 40, like the fellow we're going to see later on that does 20, oh, that's already a statement that says, that was really, had its good parts, but it had its bad parts too. So in saying that the land was quiet for 40, is peaceful for 40 years, it's basically giving a positive judgment on Gideon, but it's not superlative. It's not what we have on Ehud. Now, if you ask me, until this point, Gideon is superlative. Until he starts with the ephod, I would have thought this is an 80-year guy, okay? This ephod thing puts him back into the standard. Well, he's good, he's really good, but there's a little problem there, and that, I think, is part of the judgment that we see in verse 28. Okay, So we go on. So Yerubbaal, son of Joash, retired to his own house. Interesting, by the way, that suddenly Yerubbaal, of course, is Gideon. It's the same guy. Yerubbaal is the name he was given, which represented fighting with the Baal. That's what the word meant, fighting with that pagan god, the Baal. So I think this verse also says something to us, okay? Here's the guy that was fighting with the Baal, and then he starts this slippery slope with the ephod, okay? And I think that's another way of reminding us of the problematic, the problem of what he's done, okay? And then we learn about his personal life. He had 70 sons, he had many wives, okay? And then we learn about this son who is going to be most significant to us in chapter 9. He had a concubine in Shechem, and his name was Avimelech. Now, I don't know if you know, Avimelech is very simple Hebrew. It means my father was king. Interesting, because Avimelech's father was everything except a king, and yet Avimelech has this name. My name, my father's a king. And you have to wonder if Avimelech was really the name that his father gave him. Probably not. It could be, however, the name his mother gave him. If she's a concubine from Shechem, and I think it's very clear to us as we read the story, she was not an Israelite woman. She was a Canaanite woman. Now, I will remind you, for those of you who studied Joshua with me, when we have the list of 31 kings in Joshua that are defeated, the king of Shechem is not there. And we discussed then the idea that Shechem was never destroyed and captured, and it remained a Canaanite city, but there are also these theories that they were Canaanites in one sense, but they may have been descendants, or they were descendants of the original Shechem and Hamor, the people that we meet in the book of Genesis when we see the story of the rape of Dinah. Okay, Jacob's daughter Dinah goes out into the city of Shechem, and she's grabbed by Shechem, and the man Shechem, after whom the city is named. He's clearly a Canaanite, and they are forced to circumcise, and then the sons of Jacob come and have killed a whole bunch of them. But there's this idea that maybe remnants remained, that they have some kind of a different kind of relationship with the nation of Israel. And we discussed that when we did Joshua, the fact that Shechem was never captured. So we have a city, Shechem, where you have Israelites and Canaanites living together, not in an enemy situation, but you still have a situation of a Canaanite influence, okay? And that's clearly who his mother is, all right? And so I believe she's the illegitimate wife of Gideon. She's the concubine, but she is very important for her that her son is seen to be son of royalty. So she calls him, my father is the king, because she wants to see herself as affiliated with the powerful man Gideon, who it's in her interest for her to see him as king, and that kind of beats up her influence or her pride when she's the illegitimate wife and all these other wives are legitimate. So here he's got this son Avimelech, who's the son of the concubine, and 70 other sons who are the sons of legitimate wives. So we have already set up a very problematic family situation here, and I think that's something that we have to keep in mind as we go in to understand what happened. So I'll just quickly finish the chapter. We'll start with chapter 9 next time. Gideon, son of Joash, died at a ripe old age. It was buried in the tomb of his father Joash at Ophrah of the Abizarites. Again, someone who dies at a ripe old age, it means that he was a righteous man. Okay, we have that very often in the Bible where these bad guys don't end well, but anyone who specifically says he not just died at a ripe old age, but you have the sense of a peaceful death, he lived a full life, that is going to be a righteous man. It's just one more way for the Bible to give us its judgment on Gideon. After Gideon died, the Israelites again went astray after the Baalim, and they adopted Baal-Berith as their god. Well, we knew this was coming because the Bible hinted at. They start with the ephod, then they're going after the ephod, and then we have that name Yerubbaal, verse 29, almost cynically. Remember the guy who fought the Baal? Well, now he hasn't done such a good thing. And of course, once Gideon dies, it's just anarchy. And they're just going after the Baal. The Israelites gave no thought to the Lord their God, who saved them from all the enemies around them, nor did they show loyalty to the house of Jerubbaal, Gideon, in return for all the good that he had done for Israel. So this last few verses here, of course, set the scene for the disaster that happens in chapter 9. We will then meet Abimelech and all the terrible things that he does, and how this is a guy who crowns himself king, who is the very opposite of what you want a king to be. So that's it for today. So we had this class 2 weeks in a row. Amazing. Anyone want to say anything, ask any questions? Now's the time. No, everybody's smart today. Great. Excellent.
Good lesson. Good lesson. That's awesome.
Anyway, have a great week, everybody. And
thank you so much. Thank
see you again, hopefully. You're welcome. Bye-bye, everybody.
I hope you enjoyed that video. And we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below, as well as on the notification bell. And that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.